Welcome to the Israel Now Forum webinar series. I'm Maura Schreier Fleming, Chairman of the Israel Now Forum Speakers Committee. The Israel Now Forum is scheduled for November the 16th in Plano, Texas. We want to thank our webinar partners, Southwest Jewish Congress and Texans for a Safe Israel. Today's webinar features Toba Hellerstein. She is the founder and CEO of Attune Now. The website is attunenow.org, ATTUNENOW.org. Her company specializes in emotionally resonant communication strategies to counter propaganda campaigns, particularly those focused on Israel. For the last year, Toba led a comprehensive study, not only on what people know and think they know about Israel, but also what changes hearts and minds. Please use the Q&A Zoom feature to submit your questions during the webinar. We'll have time at the end for questions. And now we'll speak with Toba about anti-Semitism, insights, and strategies for change. Toba, thanks for joining us. And your research is groundbreaking. Can you talk about what makes it so groundbreaking?
Yeah, so many researchers and groups do research around anti-Semitism, but typically what this looks like is tracking anti-Semitic incidents over time, increases in it, tracking people's perceptions of anti-Semitism. It's polling, asking people to say, do they support Jewish life, Jewish safety, things like this. And so the problem is a lot of this is quantitative. So that's great in the sense of you're understanding, patterns across the country. But the problem is you never get underneath the hood of what's driving the opinion. And so even if you have opinions that you're able to track, you're not able to figure out, well, what shaped those opinions and what can alter them. And the truth is, so the research that I did, this originally came from I was running research for a bunch of different groups that were looking at how to have more effective communications and fighting anti-Semitism. And I initially had sought out to just aggregate existing research and extract insights that could be used in an actionable way. But it turned out there was no body of work that actually had that. There
What
was
made it that way? What made it that there was no body of work?
It's a really good question. So I have a lot of theories on this. I think that but traditionally when research is done, I mean, you see this in Jewish life in general, right? We have so many different Jewish organizations. We have almost nothing that is dedicated to outreach with non-Jews specifically.
Hmm.
Right. So, in most Jewish organizations, there will be like a little bit that's dedicated to that, but you don't have a ton of life that's dedicated to that. And that comes from, I know we were speaking about this a couple months ago, Jews, we don't evangelize. And so
Hmm.
unlike Christians and Muslim groups that are so used to being outward client facing, right? We're not outward facing.
Yeah.
We're thinking about our community. And so I think that what that begets is a situation where I think we do struggle to understand non-Jewish audiences, and we don't have a lot of practice with that sort of outreach because there's no intention around conversion. And so this idea of building, community ties for, greater support for the Jewish community, traditionally we've done that at an institutional level. You've got
Hmm.
groups like APAC or, groups that are doing this around government, usually national government, usually not even state or local government, but around Congress for approving defense systems, or maybe this is groups of business leaders to get more investment. But these are institutional stakeholders. It's very different than Gen Pop, right? The general public of America, and doing outreach that kind of attunes to normal average Americans who are not in positions of power. And so, yeah, so we have a huge gap because that hasn't been a strategic priority in the past.
So it sounds as if your research focused on what were the opinions about Israel of non-Jews. So could you go into some of the particulars of that research so we know what you did?
Yeah, sure. So this was qualitative research. So this was IRB credentials, which is the highest, academic grade that you can get. And the focus in terms of Americans was looking at Gen Z and millennial. So this is
Oh,
Black and Latino, Gen Z and millennial, and then also white moms. And the reason why it was not just Gen Z millennial, it was also white moms is I was also looking at the contagion effect. So you have this strong, growing anti-Zionist sentiment amongst young people, but then you have this contagion where it started off to be this like thing that you only heard on Berkeley campuses, right? And it became more and more mainstream. And now you're seeing this in like, like kind of polite culture, American polite culture of older generations too. And so it was tracking how that bleeding out effect happens. So people who have their, people whose kids are at college, to what degree do they end up adopting the views of their children who are becoming really anti-Zionist? And if they are adopting those views, what leads them to do it? And so that was super illuminating, partially because I think because we see so much in the news around these anti-Israel protests at colleges, I
mhm.
think we forget that there's a huge socioeconomic variable. I call it anti-Zionist privilege
Talk
because
about that.
so you really don't see the animation around anti-Zionism comes from privileged people. This is
Hmm.
people of higher socioeconomic levels. So it doesn't, so it's not just people who were raised with a high socioeconomic level, it's people who are socialized in that. So you will find people who came from poor backgrounds, but then they went to college with other people who were from higher socioeconomic levels. They're socialized in that and then they adopted too. But what you see a huge, huge gap in is if you look at Black and Latinos across the US who are just normal working class people who were not socialized in that environment, you don't see this animation uh, of um, of opposing Zionism in Israel. You don't see that.
So did you find in the groups that, well, I should say, what did you find by group? You had the college students. Did you segment the findings of anti-Semitism in that group? You just referred to the African American community that you didn't find the anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. Can you talk about which groups in your research came up to be the source of the anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism?
So I wouldn't say exactly groups by the source, but I would say there are groups that definitely tend to be more anti-Semitic. So for example, groups that have a mentality of conspiratorial thinking are going to be more anti-Semitic. So for example, so Black Americans tend to have more conspiratorial thinking because they have a history where there were things that happened that kind of lent themselves to things that look like conspiracies, right? So that they have a bit of a reason to have this sort of mentality, but they end up applying this universally in a way that ends up really vilifying Jews. So, for example, if you talk to Black Americans about successful, Jews who are hardworking and successful, they view that as conspiracy of maybe Jews hoarding wealth or only taking care of their own. Whereas if you ask Latinos, they think, wow, hardworking, like this is a strong value that we share because you don't have as much conspiratorial thinking from that group. So there's a lot of like correlated variables that go into this. You also see very different perceptions of Jews from these different groups in terms of like when you ask them what are the um, best traits of Jews, or what are the worst traits of Jews? You see
What
a
did you find? What did you find by group?
well, so actually, why don't we play? Actually, I want to give you the overall one because there was an overall picture, and I want
Good.
to I want to have you guess actually. So
Oh, okay.
what do you? Because I think it'll be illuminating. So what do you think were the best qualities of Jews according to Americans?
We're smart.
Do you have a second? Do you have a let's do two. I'll give you a second guess because the first one's wrong. I'll give you a second one.
They're wealthy.
So okay,
They're white.
so this is that for positive or is that just general perceptions? This is positive.
Positive to be smart, rich.
Okay. So So Jewish people, we all tend to really focus on outcomes and achievements as opposed to who and why and identity. Americans are the flip. Americans really want to know who Jews are as people, and they care very little about what we've achieved and what we've done. So we think about intelligence, education. We think about, you ask Jewish people what are the best traits. It's like tikkun olam, the ways that we've helped out in the world, all of the Nobel Prizes, all of the innovation. None of that showed up for Americans. So
So
what America,
your groups did not say positives about Jews about of the things that Jews say that are positives about us. Is that correct?
yes, there's a huge misattunement that the Jewish community has around what are the positive perceptions of Jews. And that's really, really important because if you want to increase positive perceptions, you want to swim downstream. So you want to focus on bringing to light traits that Americans already like and appreciate and value.
So tell us what they were. So
Okay.
because I'm wrong.
Okay. So the biggest ones were humor,
Oh,
family values, hard work, and tight-knit community. Those were kind of the four strongest ones. Now, what's interesting, if you look at these traits, what's really important if you're thinking about how to positively affect, perceptions of Jews, it's really important that the traits don't have a downside. So for
hmm.
example, tight-knit communities, so that's something that Americans really value. We have a loneliness epidemic. The fabric of society is sort of being torn apart. So people really value tight-knit community. But what's the problem? The downside of saying Jews are tight-knit is saying that they're insular, right?
Mm,
So it carries a
right.
liability with it. Hard work has a little bit of a liability, but less so. Hard work is such a core American value, right? Grit and really putting your all into things. In certain communities, it can carry the downside of like associated with money, and it can kind of carry those tropes. But I would say hardworking generally is a pretty good one. The
Mm.
really safe ones are family values and humor. There's just no downside to them. So they're really, really high leverage. And the other thing I'll kind of say ancillary to that is the I was asking groups, what are the what's your favorite thing about Jews? And in every single group, people talked about how much they liked Adam Sandler. And I thought it's so important if we're going to be doing communications where we bring in Jewish celebrities, because there are a lot of initiatives to work with Hollywood to have campaigns with Jewish celebrities. We have to be looking at who do Americans already like. And we
Mhm.
don't do that. We think about Jewish celebrities who we like and we want them to say things. But if we're think all of this work is about attuning to Americans and what is effective and what resonates for Americans. So this is about, really figuring out what speaks to them most. And so, that was very interesting around Adam Sandler. I have one quote that I loved from one of my Black groups, which was the person was talking about how much they didn't like Jews, and they said, "Oh, but Adam Sandler, I fuck with him." It's like this is the exception. Like this is someone who, despite not liking Jews in general, I really like him. And what that does is that creates an opportunity because this is all about building trust, and you want to start with characters and traits that people already like, and then you can build from that.
So you have these perceptions, these positive perceptions that your study candidates said about Jews. Tell us what the negatives that they said, so we as Jews understand what they thought about or they think negatively about us.
It's interesting. The negative ones were way more intuitive. The
Hmm.
negative ones were way more reflective of what we would expect people would say. So the negative ones were actually really not very surprising. It's communities that have more conspiratorial thinking. It's around Jews controlling media and money and things like that. You have sort of those tropes, a lot around like stinginess and greed. But yeah, these are the tropes that Jews kind of expect, like Jews controlling the media. These are sorts of the tropes that we sort of anticipate. I will say though, what was really interesting was um, there was something that emerged pretty universally, not in the white moms group, but in the millennial and Gen Z groups,
Uh-huh.
was Kanye West and the whole controversy around that.
Hmm.
I had not appreciated how angry Black people were at Jews around this idea of like censoring Kanye and like the amount of solidarity that was with Kanye West around the anti-Semitic comments. And something that I discovered within this, which leads to a broader point,
Hmm.
is that, and we talked about this earlier before this call started, there's this huge, knowledge gap in America of, people know very little bit about Jews in Israel. They know almost nothing about Jewish history, Jewish persecution. They don't have that context. So what happens is when you have Jewish groups and leaders, in an outrage against violent anti-Semitic comments, we understand why we're doing that because we have this understanding of, well, this is how violence goes. This is how persecution has always gone. It starts with language and it normalizes and it goes to action. But there's a way in which we don't like share the math. We're going to the outcome of the censorship, but we're not actually sharing, this is why we're afraid of this. This is what's happened before. We're kind of assuming that Americans have all the same reference points. And so what happened was when I would talk to these groups about this and I would share more of like, these are the Jewish community's fears, you got a lot more compassion and empathy. And I think we assume that they have these reference points that they don't. So that ended up being effective because think about it. If you have Jews who are, if we have Jewish groups who are trying to shut down anti-Semitic comments and Americans have very little context about why it's so dangerous, what does that look like? That looks like power in media. That looks like control of media, right?
Right,
But then
right.
when you share fears around how this has looked in the past, people aren't looking at the outcome, the action, they're looking at the why, and
Uh-huh.
the why is then relatable, and it helps them with the adoption of the action.
You just highlighted something that I would love you to address, and that is how to communicate with people who might be anti Semitic to address it. Because your research came up with some answers as to how to communicate effectively with people who have, like you say, don't understand our history, don't understand the values, whatever. But how do you, what are your conclusions? How do you recommend you talk to people that have these distorted ideas about Jews and Israel?
So before I answer that, I think there's two different buckets when we look at anti-Semitism. And I think this is true throughout history. If you look back at German society too, this really holds is like you have this group of people who are like vehemently, viscerally anti-Semitic, who like, and then you have the majority of people who passively adopt it, and they're still anti-Semitic because they're adopting it, right?
Mhm. Right.
But it's not coming from as much of a passion as it is from there's a critical mass of information and perceptions that they're passively adopting it. And these two categories are really important. So my research is not about reaching people who are passionately anti-Semitic because
Mhm.
that's a dogma that like that's something that's a there
You're
may
not going to reach them. You're not going to reach them.
well, I don't want to say never, but like that's just it's a small portion of society is the thing.
Good.
That's not the
Okay.
majority. Even people who are saying things that are anti-Semitic, it's if they change their view based on and this is sort of the findings of the research is that anti-Semitism is dehumanization, right? This is
Right.
reducing Jews and Israel to symbols, right? So it's the symbol of Jews were the symbol of the reason why German had a horrible economy and was impoverished in the world. It was Jews, and now
Scapegoating.
yeah, and now Israel is the symbol of colonialism, racism, oppression. It's like fill in the blank. If you don't
Right.
like capitalism, Israel's the symbol of that, right? And so this is about symbolism. So the key to dehumanization is humanization. So what this
Hmm.
means is this is showing human relatable experiences and personalities as Israelis as individuals, Jews as individuals. Now, if people are confronted, and I'll share more about that, but if people are confronted with this humanized version of Israelis as people and Jews as people and storytelling that helps explain Jewish experience, if that's not moving the needle for them, they're in this hardened camp. And we're
That's
not really,
awesome. Yeah.
yeah. And so I think the key in fighting anti-Semitism is identifying these two different camps, and it's simultaneously marginalizing the hardened people, and with the grand majority of people, you don't want to, yell at them and wag your finger because that makes people more defensive and it
Right.
entrenches them in whatever view they have. So the key here is, it's sort of the wisdom you have in any sort of good negotiation, right? Like hostage negotiation, political negotiation. This is obviously my background is in this. And this is about under validating the experience of where the emotions come from and then piecing those apart from making Israel the symbol and the culprit of those emotions.
So let's get specific. So if somebody tells someone here that's listening that Jews control all the banks, which is the dogma piece that you've mentioned, you're probably not going to have an impact on them. You might just move on. What about somebody who says something that's Jews shouldn't be in Israel, that they should be protecting the Palestinians, or whatever, that's more political? How would you specifically address that in a conversation with someone that says that to you?
So I would actually even push back on the first one
Oh,
is
tell us, tell us.
because you know what? What's interesting is what I found really effective was when people would talk about Jewish dominance in banks and media, what I found very effective was giving them some context of why Jews were so dominant in those industries. So like banking, medieval Europe, we weren't allowed to own land. The only profession was money lending. So we became good at it because it was the only thing we were allowed to do. And then Hollywood, Jews were banned from media institutions. So we had to create a new institution. And like, luckily it did really well, but like that's why there's so many Jews there. And when we explained it in those terms, I mean, this was so effective. This wasn't effective with everyone, right? So this is
Hmm.
where are you passively anti-Semitic or are you actively anti-Semitic? Okay. So this is the
Uh-huh.
difference between do I really want to believe Jews are evil and I will only take in inputs and information that confirm that? Or have I thought that Jews have bad intentions because I've seen these associations? But if you tell me more context, I realize, oh, wow, those aren't really true. And that changes my mind. And so
Uh-huh.
what we found was, especially in the Latino groups,
Hmm.
they would talk about this was so easy for them to understand. They would say, "Oh yeah, like like a lot of Latinos are dental hygienists. Like there's a lot of Indians own corner stores. Like you see this
Right.
Koreans who own like nail salons. It's not a racist thing to see pattern recognition that certain groups are in certain careers. It only becomes problematic when there's a conspiratorial aspect. And if you're telling the whole story of this is how we got into this profession, and it's a very human story. It takes away the conspiratorial part of this because you're seeing how it happened as opposed to imagining that there were these like nefarious people at the top that kind of made it happen. So that's it. So that's the first pushback. But the
Okay.
the answer to your question though about anti-Zionism and people saying
Yes.
about
Yes.
about Jews not deserving Israel. So this is an area where I think there's a lot of confusion about what is political opinion and what is anti-Semitism.
Okay.
Anti-Zionism is just a flavor of anti-Semitism.
Mhm.
But people are allowed to have political views that are critical of Israel, but where does it cross the line? So
Right.
like if you a political view is like, I don't like this government in power, I don't like this policy, I don't like this way that, a war is being conducted. Those are fair as long as they are consistent with your views of other countries in the world. So if
Mhm.
you are really, really obsessed with Israel, but you don't have any personal attachment to it and you don't really know anything about it, and you hold it to a standard that you don't hold any other country to, then those political views are not political views. Okay. Right. So that's kind of how this is the double standard. This is the hyper focus. Um, but when we look at anti-Zionism, we're looking at delegitimization, dehumanization, and double standards. And so if people say, okay, I heard that Israel was formed in this really in this way that displaced people and that makes it not have the right to exist. Well, I'm sorry, no country gets to exist because this is just how countries are formed, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
and some people will say like, well, this was true before, but when Israel was formed, this was more modern. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. Like this is like the age of decolonization is when Israel was formed. Like most countries were still formed this way, right? So arguments like that, if you push back with that and they still hold the rigidity, you're talking to someone who wants to believe that Israel is evil, right?
And you wouldn't even just say to them, the Israelis, the Jews were the indigenous people there, and then you get a response like, "Oh, I didn't know that," or what would you
So
expect to get?
You could. I mean, like if people said, "Oh, I didn't know that," and if that changes their mind, like we're trying to tease out what is anti-Semitism versus what are people who are reachable if you approach them in a different way. And so the I would say the least common denominator for the findings from the research are that you don't bring you don't bring facts to a feelings fight. Okay. Most
Right,
people know
right.
almost nothing about Israel, and their buy-in for why they are pro-Palestinian or hating Israel has nothing to do with facts. You can't, and so you can't reason someone out of a belief that they didn't use reason to get to. So
Hmm.
this is about understanding what are the emotional motivations of Americans that lead them to anti-Israel sentiment or pro-Palestinian sentiment. And so I have a whole segmentation of this. I'll give you a couple because I think we're pressed for time a little bit.
Little bit time, yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, so the general two emotional entry points of being pro-Palestinian in America are and are so one is anger and contempt and distrust of institutions. So this one's an interesting one. So America has a big, this is an American problem. And I think we've all heard this, that anti-Semitism is always a symptom of a societal problem. And this research confirms that entirely, is
Hmm.
that we have loneliness epidemic, we have a meaning epidemic, we don't trust our institutions. Whether you're left or right, you think government is corrupt. You might be thinking about different parts of government, but everyone thinks that government is corrupt and doesn't trust government, right? And so
Right.
what that means is you have so much anger and resentment, and and this creates an elevation of anti-hero culture. And you see this on the left and the right. You see anti-heroes, of every political stripe. But an anti-hero a is about characters who are necessarily ugly, and what they're doing is necessarily odious, because to take on the horrible nature of this corrupt thing that they're fighting against, they have to be just as ugly or uglier than it is. So what this means is when you have contempt and distrust and anger towards institutions, it creates this permissibility for actors to do really ugly things, and they're not held accountable for their actions, because part of being an anti-hero is that this sort of thing is justified. So if you look at, yeah.
You're saying that what the Palestinians are doing is is being perceived by Americans who inherently distrust government. It's almost justifying what the Palestinians are doing to respond to the Israelis. Is that kind of
And
correct?
this is done very much intentionally by their part. So the messaging that you see on college campuses, this is anti-hero messaging. This is like the cool, rebellious, you have to burn it down kind of thing.
Right.
They're doing this very intentionally. And so this is really, really poignant in American culture. So, so I think so we have to look at these sorts of archetypes. So archetypes are these, it's a Jungian idea of like emotional storytelling. So Americans don't, we have a huge education problem. It's taking on the task of educating Americans is way too high, because this is an entire crisis in the country, right? And the Palestinians have managed to garner an enormous movement without people really understanding anything about Palestinians. So that
So,
tells us
so
that
if we say that people admire the hero, how can we position Israel as the hero, even in a conversation, if you're
yes.
trying to change hearts and minds?
So the archetype right now for Israel is the king, the ruler. So this is power and stability and control, and this works really, really great if you are lobbying Congress for defense systems and you want them to trust them. And it works really, really great if you're trying to get investors to put in, billions of dollars, and you want them to know that their investment will be sound. But this was not designed for Gen Pop. This was not designed for empathy or creating resonance with Israelis. And it conflates Israeli people with Israeli government. And Americans don't like government right now. So you're in this losing battle. So your question of what's the right reframe. So
Yes.
the research that so one of the big findings was the right archetype for Israel is what I call the flawed hero.
Mhm.
So the king and the ruler, this is about the outcome, that the outcome is order, the outcome is control, but it's not a humanized take, because it's not about who the ruler is or why, right? This is not a personal thing, it's outcome. So what we want and Americans really resonate with the who and the why. So
Mhm.
the flawed hero is this embodiment of loyalty, of resilience, of scrappiness, of hard work, of overcoming all these values that Americans really value. But then the flawed piece is this ownership of, and it's really hard, and we're not going to get it right, and we're going to keep on trying, right? It's this vulnerability of, yeah, this is messy, and we're not claiming to be perfect. And the reason why that's so important is that if you're a ruler and you make one misstep, you plummet into a tyrant, right? You fall from grace really fast. And there's no way, because it's a war and because the Israeli government situation is just so messy, you need to have an archetype that allows for that messiness and to still have resonance and compassion for Israelis.
It sounds like, Toba, we have a lot of work to do. You can certainly help make that work happen. And I want to thank you for your time today. This was an incredibly enlightening discussion about the sources of anti Semitism. And wow, thanks so much for participating. And I want to thank everyone for attending today. We are looking forward to seeing you again at our next webinar with Gil Hoffman of Honest Reporting on Sunday, May 18th at 1 p.m. Central. And we hope to see you all in Plano, Texas on November the 16th for the all-day Israel Now Forum, where you can hear more from experts on Israel today. The website is www.israelnowforum.org. Thank you, Toba. Bye for
Thank you so
now.
much.